Hi everybody, my name is Andrea Capiluppi.
Nemitari Ajienka.
So we are the authors of this paper that we submitted and got accepted at Sohill. So we are happy to present it today as a video. Um, so the title was Taxonomies, like a long title, but we shortened it up into Taxonomies and Beyond. So we're going to share some of our findings about empirical evidence in terms of what sort of taxonomies are more, let's say, effective at capturing the categories and whatnot, and also how there are possibly some dependencies between taxonomies in terms of if some categories are more likely to be contained into others. So the idea about taxonomies is that in terms of software health, when we start comparing systems, we found that in previous works that software systems are more apt to being categorized in bigger containers. That's what we call categories. And the categories then in past works at the Sohill, we actually produce some evidence that categories could be clusters of analysis. And in this particular study, we found that the clusters could be even having a relationship between each other. So one cluster could be larger than another one in terms of some characteristics. So that's what we try to do in this particular study. So the first thing that we found is that there are typically two types of taxonomies, the top-down and the bottom-up. I personally know about top-down taxonomies in terms of the SourceForge ones. I'm not sure whether Nemitari has got any other taxonomies, but you can sort of browse the software that maybe SourceForge.net organizes the software and the projects in, and there are like some 20 categories. And some of them are bigger, and some of them are smaller, of course. But in general, the top-down taxonomies, you do not have the power to sort of change them and to understand what sort of macro categories you can add or how to consider them in general. And the the other one is the bottom-up taxonomies. And maybe, I don't know if you want to talk about the two types of taxonomies that we found so far. Um,
So we did have a look at the two taxonomy types. So from a higher level, we had the top down, which was for example, the SourceForge categories. So the top down is essentially software categorization done by institutions higher up. So SourceForge, maybe GitHub, Unix, or Ubuntu. And then for the bottom up, we found some examples in the literature. So the bottom up taxonomies are software categorizations that are done by researchers from experience or from mining software repositories or from the software documentation like the README files. So on the left-hand side of this slide, we have an example with four main categories from a paper published in 2008. And in these four categories, they include the data dominant software, the system software, the control dominant software, and the computation dominant software, where you have more of, for example, networking software. And on the right-hand side, we have a more recent sort of categorization, which might include subcategories of the one on the left-hand side. So on the right-hand side, we have 6 categories, which were derived from the software documentation and the README files of around 5,000 software repositories from GitHub ecosystem. So the 6 categories on the right include the application software, documentation category, non-web libraries and frameworks, software tools, system software, and the web libraries and frameworks. So for example, the RESTful web services, micro services for web applications, and so on.
And for me, the one thing that comes, of course, the obvious thing is that how many categories do you want to have in your taxonomy? And of course, the other point is how do they map to each other? So how do I know that something that maybe is an application software could be mapped into a system software or a control dominant software? So there is a one of the questions is about, so how many categories do you want to have in your particular taxonomy? And again, the second question is how do they sort of fair against each other. And we did one small example in the paper. And so there was a paper in 2012 about the naturalness of software, and they sort of put like as an umbrella system is the operating system called Ubuntu, and then there was like all the categories of software that they sort of understood in terms of the various types of system, and they go like text, sound, they have main docs, and so on and so forth. And then when using the taxonomy that we just presented earlier in terms of the bottom-up one, the one that created in 2008, you can see that the same sort of layer of Ubuntu maybe belongs to the B category of the other taxonomy. Maybe the tech one belongs to the A category, and then of course the taxonomy of 2008 is very articulated. So you start with the A, but then you scroll down into the con, into the other parts of the taxonomy, and then it becomes an exercise of mapping things to each other. So the two problems that we try to analyze in this particular paper are number one, how many categories are in a taxonomy, and the second one, which I think yielded the better results, I think, is there a relationship between categories of a taxonomy? So the first study was done by Nemitari, and the second one was done by myself. So Nemitari is going to show the first one.
Okay. Yeah, so this was the first case study. So we took 11 blockchain-oriented software projects. So these are projects that are focused on implementing smart contracts for the Ethereum blockchain network. So the Ethereum blockchain network is based on, it's kind of taking some ideas from the Bitcoin cryptocurrency system, whereby you have a decentralized system for exchanging tokens between different parties who might not know themselves. And so because it's decentralized, you have some algorithms to ensure that there's consensus. So each person knows the balance of the other party. There's no chance for replaying transactions, so there's no chance to cheat the system. And then you can only append transactions or data to the blockchain, and it's also immutable as well to ensure security. So Ethereum is like the second generation blockchain because on top of the cryptocurrencies, you can also build your own programs called smart contracts. And you can deploy these programs, which are essentially computer code, to the blockchain. And every interaction with this code would also take advantage of the blockchain features, which are append-only, immutability, and also enabling parties to transact between themselves using decentralized and distributed contracts. So we took 11 projects which are focused on the Ethereum blockchain smart contracts, and we divided these smart contracts into two categories, the token category, and the second category was for smart contracts with other use cases. So for example, decentralized insurance, microinsurance, prediction markets, and so on. While the token smart contracts were either creating a new cryptocurrency or focused on cryptocurrency exchange, for example. So we compared the smart contracts from this project using popularly known object-oriented software metrics, like the number of children, coupling between objects, weighted methods per class, and so on. And on the next slide, we have some results. So on the left-hand side, we have a table which shows sort of the spread of or the measurements of these metrics along the two sort of domains or categories. And we observed that in the token category, they use a higher number of, for example, in the token category, there's more inheritance, so there's a deeper inheritance tree. And this could be due to the fact that there are certain token standards. There are certain tokens, standard smart contracts that people sort of inherit when creating their own tokens for the Ethereum blockchain. So for example, you need to inherit the methods that help people check their balance, or the methods that help people transfer these tokens between themselves. And then you can also add your own functionality on top of those. Another thing is that the number of statements or the number of children, for example, in the others domain is sort of higher compared to the token domain. And on the right-hand side, we also observe that the resources that are required to deploy the token contracts share different correlations between these different software attributes. So, for example, again, with the token domain, there's more inheritance in that domain, and that leads to a higher level of correlation. So the more inheritance you have, the more resources you need to spend to deploy those contracts to the blockchain.
Right, and yeah.
Yeah.
So for the second case study, we took the taxonomy that was presented in 2018 was based on 5,000 projects. We took the Java projects, which is 520, and actually using their own categories, the ones that we just presented, the application software, documentation, so on and so forth, and we put them in their categories. And using the same software metrics, we tried to say whether or not any of those categories, clustering all the projects of that particular type, was different, equal, or sort of larger than the other, or smaller than the other. So essentially, we try to understand whether or not the projects that were clustered in one particular category had any of the characteristics, of the software metric characteristics, that were sort of diverging or converging or similar to the other ones. And so it's a long table here, but essentially we're saying that on the first row here, the AES is the application software versus the documentation. And we notice that the coupling between objects can detect a relationship of smaller than. So typically the application systems projects have got a coupling between the objects smaller than the projects appearing in the documentation cluster. So we could identify smaller than, which is the red bits, the different ones. So definitely there was like in the green cells is the ones where there was definitely a difference between the categories, between the clusters of projects, but we could not detect a direction larger than or smaller than. And then in the yellow ones, we could not detect any differences between the projects coming from a category or the other. So in case of the third row, the application systems and the software and the system software, we could not detect any differences in terms of number of children, LCOM, and the DIT measurements. But in all the other ones, we could detect either that they definitely come from different population, or even better, we could detect that there was a direction between the relationship of the clusters. So doing that, we try to put all this information in one particular, let's say, summarization. And the idea is that the documentation projects, in general, have got all the attributes, or in general, just like the object-oriented attributes are generally larger than the web libraries, and then the web libraries in general have got attributes that are larger than the application systems, application software systems that were analyzed in that particular sample. And we built a tree of life, taking all the systems, and we saw that essentially that you can start putting the cluster close to each other and detecting that maybe let's say the AS projects are more similar to the WL projects than the ST projects, the software tools projects. And that means that it's not just about similarities between them. It's more about the fact that you can detect how distant they are in terms of that particular taxonomy of the in terms of the classification itself. So we came to the conclusion that it's not just important to understand how many categories could compose a taxonomy, but also how the taxonomy can be sort of broken down into bits, and what bit can be closer to another bit. just very similar to let's say the animal taxonomy, the animal kingdom taxonomy. So we got some species which are much more similar than other species, and that could be true for the software projects. And then basically we are leaving the takeaway message is that the categories of software are fundamental, pivotal elements to discuss software health. So as long as you start discussing software health and software ecosystems, we believe that it becomes much more interesting and important to discuss also about the fact that some categories are more similar to other categories than other ones. And that's the one thing that is the takeaway message for me. I'm not sure whether Nemitari wants to add any other observations.
I think also there was a previous paper on thresholds for software metrics, more importantly coupling, where it was found that software projects in the games domain are tightly coupled compared to software projects in the development domain, which are kind of loosely coupled. So this also leads on to the discussion around software health and maintenance, in the sense that one cap doesn't fit all the sort of software categories. So when thinking about different thresholds, we also need to consider the different sort of software categories as well in terms of software health and maintenance.
Okay, that was our contribution for the workshop. I hope you enjoyed that. Thanks a lot, Nemitari, for this experiment, and I'll see whether or not they accept these.